The final speaker in the open debate.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's, I think, a point of consensus that Scotland has always been one of the world's most culturally identifiable, indeed prolific countries. And because of this, there is a huge affinity for Scotland around the world. And as has been mentioned already, the report is the first to outline Scotland's international culture strategy for the future, but also outlines where we are now and shows clearly that devolution has allowed Scotland to formalise that affinity, turn it into a relationship between Scotland and those with an interest in Scotland around the world, and use it for the benefit of the people of Scotland. Now, much of the debate is centred on the issue of funding, perhaps inevitably. I attribute no credibility whatsoever to those that argue that we should be spending more money in this area, as we should be spending more money on transport, health, education, and yet at the same time gleefully accept cuts from the Westminster Government, or also attack the tax-raising initiatives of the Scottish Government. There is no credibility in that position. I think it's also true to say that it's worth, given the constrained environment we all find ourselves in, that we look at ways in which additional finance can be raised. The only person I think to have done that was Michelle Thompson, but I'd like to suggest a couple of things. First of all, it's a plea really to the Cabinet Secretary that the point, I think one of the points that I think Jackson Carroll was raising about the ability to ensure imagination informs what we do here. And I think it would be useful to have the Cabinet Secretary confirm that he is willing to push the various agencies involved, and I'm talking about Historic Scotland, Visit Scotland and so on, to make the most of the assets that we have. And I'll give a couple of examples of those. About 20 years ago, I was responsible, believe it or not, for taking the Wallace sword to New York, or the Braveheart sword, as we sought to exploit the aftermath of the movie. It was hugely well received, although I understood that if it was lost, I could never return to Scotland. But it was hugely well received. There were queues around the block coming into the Grand Central Terminal to see it. And afterwards, the benefits of that meant that the needed renovation works at the Wallace Monument were basically funded by the increased visitor numbers because of the interest the sword and, of course, the movie had created. And I think that could be done in many more areas as well. In the mid-1980s, believe it or not, I wrote to British Telecom saying to newly privatised £2 billion in profit, why did they not buy Alexander Graham Bell's house where he was born, which is only a stone's throw from Butte House in the new town, and then develop it, perhaps using telecommunications or whatever it is these days, students, to explain to people about the development of technology, which allowed, first of all, Alexander Graham Bell and Marconi to do what they did in terms of the invention of the telephone, and use that as an international pool for people to come. I think there are 2 visitor centres in Canada for Alexander Graham Bell. There's one in the States, and yet he was born in Edinburgh, and it's not been exploited, and I think it could be exploited. Similarly, John Logie Baird, given what he achieved, albeit when he was in London, there should be massive potential for us to capitalise on these things. And right around the country, and we've heard this in the committee, there are buildings which provoke niche interest around the world for different reasons, whether it's a clan-based interest or otherwise, which I don't think we're properly exploiting, and which, if we did properly exploit it, perhaps by niche advertising, we could massively increase both the visitors to Scotland and visitors to these buildings or sites around Scotland, which in turn could help fund the development, which is very hard for the Scottish Government to find the money to do. So I would think it may be not the done thing in terms of a culture debate, but a more commercial and imaginative approach, given the constrained financial circumstances that we find ourselves in, could be one that pays dividends. And also, I think if we look at the money that could be raised for that and the things that could be done, that could fund other initiatives. And it would also mean there's more money free to do some of the things which have been mentioned by members in the debate. And can I mention the Edinburgh Festival and the Fringe, which has been mentioned? I was born in Edinburgh. I've been going to events in the Fringe and the Festival for over 40 years. But I have to say there is more to Scotland than Edinburgh. There are lots of parts of Scotland that also need investment as well. And we have to confront those choices that have to be made because of constrained finances. There's no point in imagining it's not an issue. And other parts of Scotland also have to have their say. I want to see the Fringe, the festival, the various festivals that go along with it prosper. Of course, we all do. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that there are other parts of Scotland as well. Somebody, I think it was Jamie Green, mentioned the comparison with Ireland. Well, there are pretty big differences, which help to explain the different approach. First of all, they've got a budget surplus. Wouldn't that be nice? billions of pounds in a budget surplus. Also, they've not had to deal with Brexit, and they're members of the European Union. And, of course, they are independent. And if you want to see the effect of that, look at the consequences of Brexit in terms of people that are able to tour from Scotland across the EU. We've heard many of the examples already. And that space has been taken up by Irish initiatives. And it's often the case, we heard at the committee, that Scottish artists only get to go because Irish artists are willing to help them get across, particularly to Germany, but to other venues as well. So that shows the benefit, in my view, of being part of the EU and, of course, being independent. And I think if we'd had some acknowledgement of that, then it would have helped the debate. And Brexit, to be honest, the evidence that we've heard in the committee, the long-lasting effects of artists whose careers have been put in jeopardy because of the inability, for the various practical reasons that we've heard, mainly to do with visas, but also to do with the costs now and the ability to get into these countries. That will be very hard to reverse if we're honest about it, because it will take a long time to do so.
The member must begin to conclude.
I'm just about to conclude. And just to say that I think if we want to have a real debate about it, let's start from the same place. Understand what the financial pressures are. Don't pretend that they're not the case. Don't pretend that they happen in Wales, but they don't happen in Scotland. Let's start from an honest place if we want to see this sector thrive.
Thank you. And we move to winding up speakers.